Okay. Comrades, you're all very welcome to this meeting of Workers' International Network. And today we'll be discussing slavery in the modern world, the new ways in which the methods of slavery can operate in certain industries and in certain forms of employment. We're fortunate to have as our speaker Steve Cushion, author of the book Slavery in the British Empire and Its Legacy in the Modern World. Stephen is a research fellow at University College London, and among other organisations in which he's active is the Caribbean Labour Society, of which he's a committee member. So the discussion ought to be very interesting. I'm sure Steve would have a lot to contribute to us. We're all familiar, of course, with the history of slavery and the involvement of the British Empire and principally of the British monarchy in the expansion of the slave trade and the role that they played in it and the money that they made from it. We're also familiar with King Leopold of the Belgians in the Congo, where the most horrific tortures were carried out against workers on the estates that he owned personally before handing them back or handing them over to the Belgian government. But not many people are familiar with the methods taken from slavery that operate in some industries today, like indentured labor, for example, which is really kind of servitude. It's a kind of a form of slavery where workers are tied to contracts without regular wages and without proper conditions. And that operates still in some industries. Indentured labor was used a lot in the West Indies. A lot of Irish workers, Irish people were taken to work, not as slaves, but as indentured labor, which formally is different, but in fact your freedom is gone. You don't get properly paid for your conditions, and you belong to the person with whom the contract is. So there's a lot of things to look at in today's society. A number of countries still have forms of slavery, which Steve would explain. Now, any comrade can intervene and contribute to this discussion, either in the form of questions or additional contributions, after Steve's opening contribution, which he thinks might last perhaps 25 minutes. So with that, Steve, you can fire away and introduce your topic there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Uh, a couple of years ago, there was a fascinating programme on BBC Scotland entitled "Slavery: Scotland's Hidden Shame." It explored the links between Scotland and the whole business of slavery. What was really noticeable to someone not from Scotland was the constant reference to "we Scots" and the proposition that Scotland was responsible for some of the horrors of enslavement. This attempt to involve the whole population of a nation state in the guilt associated with all aspects of colonialism is common in writing about the British Empire, implicating everyone in the guilt and thereby reducing the attribution of responsibility to those who actually profited. There's a tendency amongst many historians to see national economies as if they were a single entity. This approach neglects the division of nations into classes. Profit and loss take place at the level of individual enterprises. A single businessman making an exceptional profit can be significant in promoting capitalist development, but his role is obscured if we only look at average figures and global statistics. Quantitative economics, as currently practiced, has a tendency to insulate the investor from the reality of the exploitation involved. The exploitation involved in the production of the profit it quantifies. Particularly true in any discussion of the business of slavery, based as it was on kidnapping, murder, rape, child abuse, and torture. Equally, using the term prosperity to describe total increase in national wealth can also be confusing if the distribution of that wealth is not considered. It's particularly inappropriate to discuss national income in the context of the business of slavery, when the overwhelming majority of the population of the British West Indies received no wage income at all and did not even own their own bodies. So there's an assumption that citizens and subjects of a nation state are automatically implicated in and responsible for the actions of the government, military, and ruling class of that nation. Personally, I do not accept there's any such thing as national interest. It seems to me that the term is normally used to justify or discredit the policy of the government of the day. People in England frequently say, "Oh, when we invaded Iran or Iraq," and I think, well, I didn't, and I bear no responsibility for it. In fact, me and 2 million others marched through the streets to attempt to stop it. But On the question of enslavement, there's no way that the government of England during the years of legal enslavement could be seen to have represented anyone other than the landed aristocracy, the enslavers and slave traffickers, along with merchant capital from the City of London. The first glimpse of representative government came with the Reform Act of 1832, which was followed almost immediately by the abolition of slavery in the British West Indies. The reparations movement demands redress for the formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants for the denial of their culture and history, human rights abuses, murder, rape, flogging, branding, denial of freedom of movement, freedom of worship, denial of the freedom to own land and the right to education, and the severe psychological damage to enslaved people and their descendants, perpetuated long after 1838 by systematic racism and racial discrimination. The descendants of the enslaved have suffered low wages, worse conditions, worse housing and oppressive policing, the institutional racism of the police, unemployment figures for young black people, the endless discrimination and petty humiliations of everyday life, the Windrush scandal. All these factors and more have their origin in the invention of racism to explain the wealth and power that the British ruling class gained from enslavement. The ending of institutional racism will require, at the very least, the complete restructuring of the police and Home Office in Britain, probably their abolition and starting again from scratch. Today, African Caribbean populations show higher instances of hypertension, diabetes, and other chronic illnesses. These are linked in part to diets imposed on enslaved populations, high stress levels, and systematic inequalities in access to healthcare. And there are ongoing environmental consequences of the legacy of slavery. The British bourgeoisie profited from Caribbean sugar slavery, from North American slave picked cotton, from the colonization of Africa and Asia, from the expropriation of the English peasantry from their common land, as well as genocide of indigenous nations. This is the so-called primary accumulation of capital, better termed initial expropriation. They used that capital to develop a fossil fuel-based economy that is the major factor in global warming and now threatens human existence in general and the Caribbean in particular. James Watt, the inventor of the steam engine, drew much of his early finance from the business of slavery. The fossil fuel-driven steam engine started industrial capitalism onto the path that leads to the present crisis of global warming and climate change. But climate change is not the only environmental legacy of slavery. The deforestation of the Caribbean islands to produce sugar, along with the soil exhaustion resulting from monocrop export-based agriculture, has severely damaged the possibilities for sustainable development. In turn, the deforestation of the region adversely affects weather patterns, making general effects of global warming more severe. At the present moment, the Caribbean islands face one of the worst threats of flooding from sea level rises and more violent hurricanes. At the same time, Caribbean victims of climate change are denied the right to migrate out of the threatened region. But they would not even be there in the first place if they hadn't been trafficked by enslavers based in Britain. Climate reparations are financial payments and other forms of assistance, including debt relief and technology transfer, that we demand from the historically high-emitting countries to third world nations to address the historical injustices and ongoing harm caused by climate change, exacerbated by colonialism. This claim is in addition to the specific demands for reparations for African enslavement. Many of today's large banks and insurance companies can be traced back directly to concerns that had their first growth as part of the slave economy. To take an example, John Angerstein, who lived from 1735 to 1823, was a marine insurance underwriter at Lloyd's Coffee House in London, then a joint founder of the Lloyd's Insurance Syndicate. Marine insurance enabled merchants to share the risk. The establishment of Lloyd's in 1771 as the leading market for marine insurance coincided with the emergence of Britain as the largest slave trafficking power and the development of the British West Indies as a major slave system. Angerstein made a fortune by insuring the business of enslavement. He then purchased Wheatling Hall Estate in Norfolk in 1808. The 4,685 acres of the former common land in the village of Brandon had been enclosed in 1774. thus depriving the villagers of a place to graze their livestock. In Africa, they stole the people from the land. In England, they stole the land from the people. But it was that same bourgeoisie that did it. Many businessmen who made their money from different aspects of the business of slavery used their profits to purchase landed estates in Britain as a diversification of business interests, a capital investment, and the purchase of political influence, as well as conspicuous consumption. Just as this transformation of rural England and the destruction of the peasantry as a class can be seen as part of the development of capitalism, it's also very much part of the history of the business of slavery. It would therefore seem reasonable to me that modern corporations descended from these early merchant banks, commodity traders and financiers should refund the unpaid wages for which their predecessors profited so handsomely, thus forming the basis of their current prosperity. £20 million was given to the slave owners in compensation for their loss of human property. The emancipated labourers received nothing for their years of toil and oppression. This compensation was largely paid by the workers in Britain, as in those days, the majority of state revenue was raised by regressive taxation on items of basic consumption, which always hit the poor hardest. The money borrowed to finance the compensation was only finally paid off in 2015. So we need to be careful that any claim for reparations for enslavement shouldn't be similarly shifted to the shoulders of ordinary people. I would argue the best way to do this would be to propose a special additional corporation tax to fund reparations, so that the descendant institutions of those who didn't pay the enslaved Africans their wages might now be made to do so. The fabulous wealth of many major businessmen, bankers and commodity traders, as well as landowners enslavers who made their fortune in the business of slavery, contrasted starkly with the overwhelming majority of the population in Britain who lived in abject poverty. Trickle-down economics was no more a reality in the 18th and 19th century than it is today. The descriptions contained in London Labour and the London Poor by Henry Mayhew, or Frederick Engels, The Condition of the Working Class in England, show most workers and poor farmers earning just about enough upon which to survive, a subsistence income that barely guaranteed the reproduction of their labour power. It might be argued that workers gained employment on the back of the profits made by the enslavers. This argument assumes that employment is beneficial to a worker, but this ignores the exploitation at the root of the relationship between management and labour. Employers employ workers to make a profit by extracting surplus value from their labour power. The investment of the profits of the business of slavery and industry and the infrastructure enabled the capitalist class to better exploit the workers they employed, but brought scant benefit to those workers, other than to raise them slightly from the ranks of the utterly destitute. Marx and Engels' views on slavery changed significantly over time, amended in the light of international events and their interaction with the mass movements of their time. As Engels put it in 1887, our theory is a theory of evolution, not a dogma to be learnt by heart. Through his relationship with the Chartist radical Ernest Jones, Karl Marx came to realise the necessity of opposing slavery and colonialism as part of the struggle against capitalism. Campaigning in London had taught Jones that the battle for the Charter was interwoven with abolitionism and anti-colonialism, and that the working class was global and multiracial. Jones was editor of the People's Paper, which became the main Chartist journal. Marx contributed 25 articles. The first issue of the People's Paper declared its anti-colonialism in this appeal to the workers. We have looked, and very properly, at the interests of European democracy. Be it ours now to look at our colonial struggles. Liberation from British rule in the colonies would be the lever for proletarian liberation in the capitalist heartland. This was a major shift in Marx's thinking because, for the first time, he recognised that colonial peoples had a capacity for revolutionary social change, a proposition that he now shared with Ernest Jones. India is our best ally, Marx wrote to Engels about the anti-colonial uprising in India in 1857. But it was the actual struggle of the enslaved themselves that really began to excite Marx's interest and revealed their revolutionary possibilities, particularly the failed uprising led by John Brown in the United States in 1859. Many veterans of the German Revolution of 1848 had made their way to the USA following the defeat of that revolution. They quickly came to see the danger posed by the slave power. This fed back into the development of Marx and Engels' thinking. Their correspondence with German American communists, particularly their old friend and comrade from the 1840s, Joseph Wedemeyer, was an important factor in the development of Marxist politics. Wedemeyer became a colonel in the Union Army and led the fight against the Confederate guerrillas on the Missouri battlefield. Marx's initial interest in the issue of slavery, having been aroused by the prospect of a slave rebellion, followed John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. He consistently urged the use of free slaves as soldiers long before it became Union policy. Marx's involvement in the campaign against slavery in the USA led him to reorganize the writing of Das Kapital. He argues that the fight against slavery is part of the class struggle and was as important as the role slavery played in the development of capitalism. When the Civil War finally broke out in 1861, Marx and Engels supported the North wholeheartedly. During the Civil War, British textile industry owners, British finance capital, and the aristocracy argued for armed intervention on the side of the slave owners, while the working class and the socialist movement in Britain, despite the hardships caused by the cotton famine, stood in solidarity with the anti-slavery struggle represented by the northern states and formed part of a mass movement against British intervention. Yet while the textile bosses, finance capital, and the aristocracy argued for armed intervention on the side of the slaveholders, the majority of the British working class, despite the hardships caused by the cotton famine, stood in solidarity with the union struggle, thereby enabling Marx and Engels to play a part in the mass movement against British intervention. In the second half of 1862, a series of pro-union working class rallies were attended by thousands of people in Lancashire and Yorkshire. It was in this atmosphere that the International Working Men's Association was formed at a large meeting in Covent Garden, attended by delegates from Britain, France, Ireland, Poland, and Germany. And I would argue that that is probably the high point of internationalist politics in British working class politics. And part of our job, I would argue, is to try and recreate it. But the organised working class in Britain, from its early days, the organised working class expressed its opposition to the enslavement of Africans. The earliest organisations of organised labour, the London Corresponding Society and the Sheffield Cutlers, were resolutely and publicly opposed to slavery. The Sheffield Steelworkers made a particularly firm connection between abolition of slavery in the colonies and reform at home. A mass meeting in Sheffield in 1794, the largest ever in the town, called for total abolition of slavery at a time when Wilberforce was merely calling for the end of the slave trade. More workers signed petitions for abolition than signed the Chartist petition for their own voting rights. Nevertheless, racism has proved an effective weapon in the army of the ruling class in the class struggle. This is not to suggest that racism was a deliberate conspiracy by a cynical ruling class. Having presided over a system based on the enslavement of Africans in the West Indies for 200 years, they clearly believe their own propaganda. There's always been a struggle inside the working class between nationalism and internationalism, as there is between class collaboration and anti-capitalism. The campaign for reparations for African enslavement and the fight against institutional racism of the capitalist state are important fronts in that class struggle. Stopping climate change and opposing racism are both social justice issues. The apology demanded by the reparations campaigners, if it's to mean anything, must be more than the regret and remorse expressed by a criminal in the hope of a lighter sentence after they've been found guilty. It must involve real and appropriate action. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. It's an extremely interesting approach to the issue of slavery. Raging class divisions, as you mentioned, in Britain, workers were suffering from the cutbacks in cotton production, and yet were prepared to take strike action rather than allow the ruling class and the owners of the cotton industry to intervene militarily on the side of the Confederacy. So a lot of these questions will be looked at in the discussion. Now, any comrade can speak. You're not confined to just one contribution, so you contribute to the discussion as you think is useful. So if you want to speak, can you indicate with the electronic hand, please? And we'll then call you as you indicate. So Matthew, see your hand is up.
Okay, thanks, comrades. A really Interesting, useful contribution from Steve. I think the thing is obviously that racism is central to the operation of capitalism itself, because obviously the capitalist class as a tiny exploiting minority requires mechanisms to split the exploited, the working class, and others. And this is central to the function of the entire system. So there's no way you can order the two. The interesting about in terms of the West Indies, I believe that actually, of course, when they started the industries, particularly obviously sugar in the West Indies, they first used indentured labour, which was from principally from Europe and other, but from other parts, under particularly savage conditions. But of course, the problem was that the entire workforce used to revolt on a regular basis. So they then used, obviously, you turn to slavery as a means of, having an oppressed and demarcated, racially demarcated workforce that can be kept in an even worse state. And again, with the splits and so on. I think in terms of the the British preservation of the slave owners, as you say, I mean the point being, of course, that the sum paid to the slave owners, of course, was enormous in terms of the British economy. It was immense. The biggest payment I think the British government had ever come up with, and that in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, they were paying these guys more than they paid for the wars. And as you say, it took them nearly a century, well, nearly 2 centuries to pay it off. And yet, of course, they absolutely refuse, to consider any form of reparation to the descendants of the actual enslaved, which is, it's typical, of course, of the British. In terms of the interesting about what happened in the US, of course, is it is a popular revolt. I think we have to see the Civil War as a popular revolt against slavery and for free labor, and the fact that there is this difference, between, obviously you can't have the two systems sit alongside each other. John Brown comes from Kansas, and the fight actually arms in hand. It wasn't a casual, it was sort of meetings and the rest of it. It was fought out for free labor in the Midwest against the imposition of slavery by the slaveholders. And it's then to see that there is this fundamental difference, and the fact that when they raised the army of the Republic, the Northern Army, of course, this was 3 million men and some disguised women. 92% of them were volunteers. People volunteered en masse to get rid of this thing. It's as I say, it's a popular rising against the slave owners and that system, and as you say, obviously involving numbers of former German revolutionaries from 1848 and other parts of the left, and of course this has not been really drawn out and explored and so on. And it actually comes down to the point where people don't understand their own history. Interesting about the Black Lives Matter movement, of course, is that at one point they started demolishing the statues of people who'd actually fought on the northern side, many cases of the left, in the Civil War, which is fundamental. And it's sent to, as you say, to draw that out, and in terms of the nature of both the nature of capitalism and the use of racism by capitalism. That the capitalism is, you could posit a non-racist capitalism, but it doesn't exist. Capitalism is racist to its very core.
Thank you, Matthew. Any other comrade wish to speak at this point? Okay, because of the pause, I'll just make a couple of points myself. I was in the United States recently, about a few years ago. I went on a tour of the areas in which the Civil War was fought. The Civil War wasn't fought over slavery. The issue was unity. A number of states broke away. and there was opposition to the breakaway, and the war began on the basis that the demand was not for the abolition of slavery, but to prevent its extension into the new territories to the west. And that's not often realized. I know that there's been a mention of the John Brown and others, but there were huge slave revolts led by black people against slavery, and that's never mentioned in the discourse over there. In Richmond, Virginia, there's an avenue, a huge avenue in a public park there, and the full length of the avenue is made up of massive statues of Confederate leaders still there, a tribute to exploitation. And a number of things that struck me when I was there, when slavery was formally, or sorry, when the slave states, if you like, were defeated in 1865, slavery was formally abolished, but a number of black people were elected to mayoral positions and other positions. And straight away, the Jim Crow laws come in, to the extent that all the discrimination against black people, all the conditions of slavery continued right up for 100 years until 1967, when the changes were forced on these states. So there's a lot of illusions about people fighting against slavery and everything being nice after 1860s. That wasn't the case at all. And even today, the divisions are absolutely massive. As Matthew has mentioned, racism is the heritage of the slave system in the United States. But there were other countries. I mean, I alluded to the Congo, where there were horrific tortures imposed on the local people in a slave system. And slavery extended into Brazil, which was the main stopping off point. Anyway, these are just additional points which I'm making because of the lack of other comrades wanted to speak. Oh, sorry, Roger's hand is up. Now, if any other comrade wants to speak, could they just indicate at this point and I'll note them down. Roger, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I wanted to thank Steve very much for a really interesting opening. And I, I was interested to make a couple of comments that occurred to me. First of all, the fact that we we sometimes tend to think of history as if it was very sharply divided into segments and into stages, and that you had first you had primitive society, and then slavery, and then feudalism, and then capitalism, and the different stages of capitalism, and so on, and that they were sharply demarcated, even if the pace in different countries was not simultaneous. But actually, it's not quite as clean and clear cut as that. That there's always a survival of what would generally be considered obsolete forms of class exploitation and of society. I'll tell you what brought this home to me. Some of the comrades will know that I made a bit of a study about India, and it struck me when I first went to India that there was it was very, very clear that there was all kinds of different forms of social relations that existed simultaneously and side by side. You had actually in some areas of the less developed areas of India, you still had tribal society, known as the Adivasis, the which were who was still actually living largely untouched by later forms of organisation and exploitation. There was also slavery on a huge scale, tens of millions of people who were classified as bonded labour, and they've been, I mean, I think that's been described already, but bonded labour meaning being actually a form of slavery when the the exploited were actually indebted, and they had no freedom to leave their employment, and they were largely unpaid and simply simply living on subsistence level, if even that. And you also have still, of course, huge areas, hundreds of millions of people who are serfs, who are in feudal society. There's still feudal relations in many areas of India. And of course, you have capitalism in all its different forms and stages, which are, including, of course, we have, some of the most greediest and um, extreme exploiters in capitalist industry. And for instance, I mean, there are at least three or four, no, I think about half a dozen people who are on the capitalists who are on the Forbes richest 40 list. And in fact, the next person expected to join Elon Musk as a dollar trillionaire is actually one of the Indian capitalists, Ambani, and there are many others who are soon to follow. So you have all of those, and of course, at the time when I first visited there, large sections of the Indian economy were actually owned by the state and run by the state. So in fact, you had side by side every possible form of organisation and property relations and forms of exploitation and levels of development of the economy, all side by side. I made the joke at the time that India was a kind of living museum of historical materialism because you could actually see in practice the development of all of these forms of society side by side and interacting upon each other. So, in that being so, I'd be interested to know, to hear from Steve. I know that he's done a lot of work on the survival of slave society and slave relations in modern society. So I'd be interested to know if you could, if you tell us a little more about that in just in that context. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for what's already, I think, a very interesting discussion.
Matthew, I see your hand is up again.
Yeah, sorry, just saying, what you said about what Finn said about the movement around the Civil War. I mean, I disagree. I mean, the point was it was a mass movement against slavery. You know, under mass pressure from the army, Lincoln announces two things: one, that black men can join the army the first time, under conditions in which numbers of them already had done as auxiliary troops and so on, that they were formally allowed to join the army of the Republic, and secondly, that he would liberate without any compensation, expropriate the entirety of slave owning in the South. That wasn't that was mass pressure. The biggest act in its time, the biggest act of human liberation and expropriation in history. It's massive, and it's not. It's from that mass pressure. I mean, when the black soldiers formally became part of the army, of course, the army wanted to pay them less, and there was then, of course, the masses wouldn't have that, and they forced them to pay them the same wages. That all soldiers would be paid the same. Unfortunately, they couldn't force integration of the army, and the American army, to its utter disgrace, remained segregated until after the Second World War. But that was the nature of that, and it's not the war wasn't purely around questions of unity or this. It was based on slavery. There's no question of it.
Thanks, Matthew. Any other comment? Oh, sorry, Steve, you wanted to speak again? Your hand is up there.
Well, just to respond to a couple of those points, I think what we see in the US Civil War was a radicalization of the northern side as the war went on, and I think also we do see in all wars what they said about this one: a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. And very often the common soldiers are fighting a different war to the to the generals and the bourgeoisie. I always remember my father said that, having lost his uncle, having died on the Somme, there was no way he would have joined the British Army in the Second World War to fight for king and country. But because it was sold to him as a war against fascism, he joined up right at the beginning, whereas Churchill and the generals weren't in the least interested in fighting fascism. They were interested in fighting German imperialism and so on. But and I think, certainly in these wars, the soldiers do get radicalized. The whole thing gets radicalized. On the question of compensation, of course, those slave states that stayed loyal to the Union, the more northerly part of the South that stayed loyal to the Union, when slavery was abolished, they were compensated. That was kept very quiet, but the slaveholders were compensated there. I tend to agree with Finn that the issue that started the war was very much the question of expansion into the West. Partly because, and I think we see this very much when I spoke about the environmental consequences of slavery, that the problem with intensive monocrop production is that it exhausts the soil. And the soil of the South was becoming exhausted. The soil of Virginia had long since become exhausted. And the slaveholders of the South wanted to move into the West, whereas the rulers of the North wanted the West to grow wheat to feed their industrial workers in the city. And an awful lot of the ordinary soldiers who fought for the North hoped to get land in the West, which does bring us up to the other side of what was happening there, was the genocide against the indigenous population. And I think it's quite interesting that General Sherman, the hero of the South, the hero of anti-slavery, then went on to lead the war against the Northern Plains nations, the Sioux, the Arapaho, and the like. And the irony of that was that very often he was able to use black soldiers to fight this genocidal war against the indigenous population of the. So there's a lot of complications here that I think we're that sort of. But I would argue, in one sense, that the South might have lost the Civil War, but they kind of won the peace. They managed to keep through sharecropping, through Jim Crow laws, through the terror of sort of proto-fascist organizations like the Ku Klux Klan. And as Finn said, it was the mid-60s before even voting rights were extended to African Americans, and there is still we see the behavior of the police in the United States, well, here as well for that matter, as a kind of legacy of that. Talking about modern indentured labour, because again, what Finn said about the indentured, the Irish indentured labour, and the first forced labour in Barbados was a mixture of Irish rebels and British royalists who were sent out there. But the problem they found was that that you send a bunch of rebels out to be indentured labour, and they're difficult to manage, to say the least. But what they were able to do, so they started bringing enslaved Africans in, and of course, in the late 1600s, they discovered a plot of Irish indentured labourers and African enslaved labourers to overthrow the system. Now, that's the slaveholders' worst nightmare. So, I mean, I think that the development and the invention, if you will, of racism was a fairly deliberate attempt to divide those two potential enemies that the slaveholders had by giving some smaller privileges, I suppose, if not being beaten to death and worked to death is a privilege, but you know what I mean. In order to make that division, and so on. So I think that's important. But today, I mean, the World Cup in the last, not the one going on at the minute, but the one before that was set in an area that I still think of as being the occupied Arab Gulf, Abu Dhabi or something. That was built by indentured labour from India, who died en masse, working in the heat in that sort of ludicrous place to hold a World Cup, and many of them died there. Their relatives got no compensation. They effectively disappeared. And so on. So that's a very recent example of forms of coerced labour, and I think it's not that long ago in Britain, probably, that people were sentenced to hard labour, convicts. There was and so on. So I think the why a paid free labourer is better value for a capitalist is because you only need to pay them as long as you need them. They're not property, there's no capital investment, and you don't have to look after them when they're ill. They are completely expendable. Whereas if you've invested money in an enslaved African, then there's some expenditure in keeping them going. And it was found after 1838, when they moved from enslaved labour in the Caribbean to paid labour, so-called free labour. It was only free in the sense, in one sense. There were still Masters and Servants Acts and all of this sort of thing. But if they could keep them off the land, which they managed to do, then you could just employ you can employ a paid labourer just for the harvest. You don't have to feed them. You don't have to feed them in their old age, and all this sort of thing. So I think capitalism only used enslaved labourers in the Caribbean because they didn't have a sufficient labour force. If there had been a sufficient labour force, they would have probably found it cheaper. But they didn't, and they had to do that. I know some people think that if there's a system of enslavement, it's not really fully capitalist. I'm of the opinion that if you look at the way the whole economy worked during that period, I think that it was just a different form of capitalism, and one thing that Caitlin Rosenthal has written a really interesting book that's entitled the origins of accountancy of modern accountancy in slavery, and so many of modern industrial relations, human resource management, that dates me, that term in itself, doesn't it? Human resource management comes directly from techniques that were developed to manage enslaved labour on plantations. And I think there is this direct continuation. So I don't really see a difference, if you will. It was merely one is a development of the other. And it's not, and as Roger said, different systems of labour management can coexist. And of course, the other thing about the enslaved was, of course, that very often, I mean, we tend to see enslaved labourers as either resisting or, rebelling or working. But actually, most of the time, there was a whole range of different methods of resisting the enslaver, sort of go slows, what we might call a work to rule, working without enthusiasm, as the Argentines so beautifully put it. And there was, and that enslaved workers, behaved very much in the same manner as employed workers in attempting to reduce the amount of work and to increase their rations and so on. So I think it's not nearly as clear cut as it's made out.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. Temos, I see you're indicating that.
Yes, I think I want to introduce another sort of slavery that we can see developing on the fringes of modern capitalism. It centers around migration, asylum seekers, and this sort of thing. Because at least we can see in Cyprus that there is a drive to push for more and more strict rules about immigration, extraditions, and creating a hostile environment for. And in this drive, they start creating a sort they push for creating sectors of the economy to become very much slave sectors. For example, asylum seekers are not allowed anymore to work for during their period of that they didn't get the permit yet, and then these people are being forced to work without permits, and every now and then the police makes raids and arrest people for illegally working. They are being punished. They are being sent home because they broke the law, but their employers they don't usually suffer. Also, the people who are allowed to work, they are not allowed to work in any sector they want. They are being pushed to work mostly in the agricultural sector, and to work as in other few sectors in the economy. And not surprisingly, these are the sectors that they are not protected by a minimum wage law or anything like that. A few years ago, I think 2 years ago, there was a big fire in some forest, and two migrants were killed by the fire because they were living in very bad conditions in very derelict housing and away from any possibility of a proper life. Or there was another one that there was a pig farm, and migrants were being housed in this pig farm in prefabricated housing, which was totally illegal. They were housed in very bad conditions. They couldn't do anything because if they tried to seek work elsewhere, they would be arrested or being thrown out of the country. So, and this is becoming quite a serious part of the economy. It's not as if we are talking about a few people here and there, but this pressure of legally forcing them to go out, and in fact letting them stay in Cyprus under semi-legal conditions, pushes them in this state. Before that, during the collapse of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, there was also a lot of trafficking in sex workers, and who were being brought to Cyprus as artists, as they were calling them, but they were being locked in their flats. They were not allowed to go out, and this sort of thing. Everybody knew about it, but nobody was doing anything. So this way of behavior, I think, is becoming more and more something that we can see, and it is very much full of slavery features. And I don't know about other countries, but in Cyprus we have seen it in quite a big scale.
Thank you, Timos. That's a very significant point, and it maybe needs a bit of attention in the discussion. I just see here, in 2005, the International Labour Organization observed what they call traditional forms of slavery persisting in some countries, such as Benin, Mauritania, and Chad. Forced labour under military conscription is found in Eritrea, and compulsory work on state projects in Congo. Widespread and systematic forced labour is in Myanmar, Pakistan, and Cambodia. So this form of bonded servitude or indentured labour is not that much different from slavery, because workers don't have standard conditions, and as Tim was alluded to, very often their homes are part of the, if you can use the word contract, if you lose the job, they lose their home. And they have to submit themselves to the most ridiculous and horrible conditions of work. So it is very much akin to what used to be known as slavery, but the ILO has found what they call traditional forms of slavery in a number of countries. So that point that Timos has raised is very significant and needs a bit of examination. Perhaps Steve might comment on it, the persistence of bonded servitude or slavery in many countries today.
On the question of the way migrant labour, particularly illegal migrant labour, is used, I cannot believe that the British authorities do not know who is organising the trafficking of illegal immigrants, as it were, over the channel. I can't believe they don't know it. They are just tolerating it, and they pick up on the ordinary person and treat them horribly. But the people who are making all the money out of it are left alone to do it. And I think that that's a significant factor. It's well known that many, certainly in Britain, the number of the people who deliver food for the sort of Uber Eats and this sort of unhygienic rubbish, that the people who deliver that are very often are undocumented, and therefore they're paid. So therefore they're paid very small amounts. That's why they have to drive those electric bicycles so furiously about, and so on. So there is this, and if we look at the United States, it's long been a real phenomenon in the in agriculture, that particularly people, Mexicans, as they're called, sort of people of Latin American heritage who've crossed the Rio Grande, and that particular way of employing them till the end of the harvest, then getting the Border Patrol to deport them before you've paid them properly. And there's a long history of that in the United States. To the extent, I mean, we know the songs, you know, Woody Guthrie's Plane Crash at Los Gatos, Tom Russell's Who's Going to Build Your Wall, and so on. In Britain, the cleaning industry. I used to be a bus driver in East London, and I used to drive, for anyone who knows the area, I used to drive a 48 bus from Leighton right into the city of London. And the first one or two buses in the morning was taking mainly African cleaners into clean the offices in the city. But then there was quite often the police would stop a bus, not very often, but it would happen that the police would then stop the bus and go look for the papers of the people on board. And we noticed that this nearly always seemed to happen sometime towards the end of the month, which sort of implied to me that people were going to be deported, and their employer or the subcontracting employer would then get away without paying them their small amount of wages that they were going to do. The hopeful thing, it seems to me, about this is the response of so many people, or many ordinary citizens. Again, we go to the United States. We look at what happened in Minneapolis when ICE, the immigration and the border police, or whatever they're called now, were basically thrown out of Minneapolis by the ordinary citizens. I mean, 2 of them lost their lives, were murdered by ICE. But nevertheless, Minneapolis defended basically its migrant population and threw ICE out. Now, I know Minneapolis is probably the most left-wing town of the United States, but that really kind of gave me a sort of a boost, you know, that it is. We've had incidents in Scotland when the border force have been driven out of areas of Glasgow by the local inhabitants who don't want to be part of it. There was an incident even in Hackney in East London a couple of years ago where this is one of the beauties of mobile phones and WhatsApp and things. A crowd of local Hackney people charged onto the streets to prevent a group of policemen who were looking at the papers of delivery drivers, and I mean, someone photographed it videoed it from the top of a bus, and it's wonderful. You know, there's just ordinary people from Hackney kicking police cars, driving them out, and I think, you know, so we, you know, it's not all. It's not all reform. It's not all you know, the sort of the Trumpists of this world. You know, I mean, our side's shown a bit of oomph as well. So that's 2 takes on it.
Thank you, Steve. Matthew, your hand's up again, is it? Or is it
yeah. Sorry, there's a few points we can make. And what Steve is referring to, of course, is the incident in Kenya Street some years ago, in which there was a crowd held a van with 2 Sikh guys in it all day, and actually then they were you know, there's a huge crowd covered for the whole Sikh. There's a film out called Everyone to Kenya Street, which people can see, which is basically about that event and the fact that the city actually rejected the whole business. The irony, the brilliant irony, of course, is that the Sikhs were then taken to the local mosque for dinner once they were released by the crowd. Which, I mean, there's great symbolism in those terms, given the history. This contrasts actually with the history of what we can say about the parts of the British working class being, intensely in favour. Well, obviously intensely in favour of the North and the end of slavery. And the fact that clearly the British ruling class itself was unable to openly declare its clear support for the South because of the fear of the reaction. The exception was here on the Clyde, where the Clyde shipbuilders were quite happy to build blockade runners. Unfortunately, as has been pointed out when by various people, that efforts to celebrate support for Lincoln and so on didn't run to here, unfortunately. So in those terms, I think also there's various other points in terms of the US history. One is in terms of what they call the Reconstruction period after the Civil War, in which black people did achieve rights and were elected and so on. And then it was a case of that was then repressed. There was that period of Reconstruction, and then there was the repression come afterwards in, I think, more the sort of 1880s or so. And actually, if you look at, you talk about all these Confederate monuments. I mean, most of those actually are built in the 20th century. They're not built immediately after the Civil War. They're built in the 20th century because of, particularly after the First World War, this rise of black movement against Jim Crow and so on and so forth. So they start throwing up all this stuff. And actually, these things are relatively recent and substantially after the events of the Civil War. The other thing, of course, is worth noting, of course, is that the 13th Amendment explicitly excludes prisons. The 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution bans slavery, ends slavery, but allows it in prisons. So we have now we have what's called the American Gulag, where we have the largest prison system in the world, in which 2 million people are forcibly indicted into, and the slavery is allowed in that system, and of course it actually carries out a considerable amount of work in terms of producing various things and doing even call centres and so on and so forth are done through prisons. So, but I'm one of those who would disagree with Steve in terms of saying that slavery is capitalism. Slavery does not operate the law of value. The law of value simply does not operate in those terms, because I mean it's not in terms of paying wages or any of this sort of stuff. It's a completely different system and in terms of the control of the workforce, it's absolutely different. It is naked force. Capitalism itself, in terms of the control of the working class, relies largely on ideology. Relies largely on politics, ideology, etc., etc. It does not rely on naked force, not all the time. Otherwise, things would be very different. It relies on naked force occasionally, or when it needs to, clearly, and has all that stuff in ready. But it does not day in daily use naked force if it can get away with it. This, of course, also, of course, changes the nature of work. The fact that you have a system where the workforce is controlled ideologically means that you can actually use serious technology. The workforce will cooperate in the use of the actual functioning of the thing. Whereas under slavery, I mean, effectively what you have is a workforce which is uncooperative and will not, and therefore cannot use any serious form of technology, because obviously the reaction of a slave is just to smash stuff. Why wouldn't you? If you can bend it or break it or whatever else under those conditions, you're going to do it. So you can only use extremely basic technology through slave systems, in those terms, and certainly not the function of the system as we have at the moment. And you can see, I mean, essentially the two are incompatible. I mean, free labour will, if you're free, then obviously you're against the institution of slavery. Clearly, and that is obviously demonstrated in the US. So in those terms, it's a critical point in terms of, actually, as you say, the use of slavery at the moment. I mean, obviously, clearly, you've got essentially what you have obviously under the system of imperialism. Essentially, what you have is a system where people are permanently held in this position, and as you say, it actually goes beyond, I think, what you've said in terms of the use of the immigration system is that that they cooperate with these people and trafficking and smuggling, but they actually openly, I think, conspire to set that system up. I mean, the British, it's a fundamental point. The British, tighten the ability to get into Britain, over a period of 10 or 15 years, and clearly, with the idea of drowning people in the Channel and instituting a system of trafficking run by gangsters. And you can see the same in the EU. I mean, the EU cooperates with particularly sort of the Libyans and Tunisians and so on and so forth in order to hold particularly, obviously, African labour in the worst possible conditions. It's quite clear that's what they want, because that's controllable from their point of view. And of course, it can then be used also in terms of an internal political control by saying, the whole of the black and brown population are all, basically conspiring against everybody else. And all the crap that we're getting at the moment, whereby we, say most recently some head case running wild around the streets of Edinburgh yesterday, attacking Muslims and saying he was protecting the country. I mean, it's just, it's horrible.
Thank you, Matthew. No, who else wants to speak? It's a very comprehensive discussion. It's covering a very, very wide range. It's very useful, very good.
Well, if no one else wants to say anything, on the question of whether slavery was actually part of the capitalist system, it seems to me that at a certain point in the development of British industry, slave cotton was essential to building up, but it was definitely a capitalist system. It was funded by it was funded through the through the City of London, through all that sort of thing. And I've just been looking. I'll plug my book now while we're here, if that's okay. But I've just looked up what I wrote about it, and Jairus Banerjee argues that it's accumulation or the drive for surplus value that defines capitalism, not the presence or absence of paid employment. I mean, as Marx wrote, the price paid for a slave is nothing but the anticipated and capitalized surplus value or profit, which is to be ground out of him. And I just wrote here, the capitalist buys the labor power of the enslaved worker, not from these workers themselves, but from their kidnappers. In that sense, they're just receivers of stolen goods. So I think it was part of the system. The whole system wasn't run on it, but it was part of the system. And I think commodity production, the extraction of surplus value, is important in seeing what capitalism is. And so, yeah, well, nice to disagree with you, Matthew, really. I'm sure we can, such a discussion could go on and on. There are many other people who take a different view from me, but Robert Brenner and the like. But I stand with C.L.R. James, with Eric Williams. There's a book come out recently by a chap called McNally, I think. It is called Slavery and Capitalism, which I think argues the case for what I'm arguing really well. But I can't remember his name properly. So anyway, there we go.
Roger, you want to speak there?
Sorry, could you hold up your book to the camera again? Ah,
Here it
okay,
is.
thank you.
It's monthly review press. If you're interested, you'll find it on the website.
Sure, thank you.
One of the advantages that accrued to the capitalists with the abolition of slavery was that under slavery, the slave belonged to the owner, and the owner had to look after the slave, the family of the slave, and generally see to their needs. Under capitalism, the capitalists only paid for the time that was spent producing commodities. Capitalism is about the production of commodities, and the capitalists only had the responsibility to pay for the labor that was used up in that production process. He no longer or she no longer had any responsibility to look after the slave as property, looking after all their needs. So there was an advantage that the capitalists were able to gain. There were a couple of good films on that theme actually made in the 70s. Just thought I'd throw that in. It wasn't all benevolence on the capitalist part.
Oh, you do surprise me.
Does anybody else want to make a contribution at this point? Well, if not, then I'm sure all the comrades agree that it's been a really useful discussion. The information that Steve has provided us with is exceptionally relevant and will cause us to think and to consider in more depth the issue of slavery and the implications for today and the extension of various forms of indentured and labor that's, well, basically servitude. So the history of the American slave trade, obviously, the international slave trade, the extension of methods of slavery into modern systems such as Steve mentioned, agricultural groups of workers from abroad coming to work on farms, not being paid by the hour, just by a contract between the person running the gang and whatever company needs the gang in the agricultural industry. That was a big scandal about 30 years ago, I think, in Britain. Agricultural groups were found like that. So now it's been an excellent discussion. I want to thank you again, Steve, for your contribution. Also, I want to thank all the comrades who contributed so knowledgeably to the discussion. And there'll be further talk about this topic in future meetings. So thank you again, Steve.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Much appreciated.
So at this point, Roger can tell us a piece about our meeting next week.
Yeah, before I do, I'd just like to again add my gratitude to Steve. I thought it was a really interesting and stimulating discussion. And by the way, I mean, the attendance was a bit disappointing, although we did have comrades from, I think, 7 or 8 countries participating. But I'd just like to reassure Steve that all our meetings are recorded, and I'm sure that there will be people who will be following this discussion on our website and on our YouTube channel. All right, for next week, it's an important meeting. In fact, the next 3 meetings are particularly significant for us because they are the beginning of our conference, the Win Conference. We've had to make it initially, at least, to continue it as simply an online event. But this is only the beginning of a discussion, and we prepared. Well, there will be a total of 4 documents that are going to be submitted for discussion, and the opening of the discussion on world perspectives will be next week. The document that we're discussing is available online. You will be circulated once again with the link. It's under the title "The New World Order." Please do come. Please do read the documents if you have time, and do contribute to the discussion. And please invite any other comrades that you're in touch with to participate too. It's a chance to really stand back and look at the whole uh, flow of events. Through what stage are we passing? What are the prospects? Are we in a period of advance or retreat for the working class? What is the way forward? What contradictions are impelling the historical process? All those kind of issues. Is a very important discussion, and obviously we're at a crucially, critically important time in world history at the present time, with with huge movements of the working class, and also ominous and quite threatening rise of fascist movements or of far right movements, of racism, and of course the open preparations and talk of world war and so on. All of these issues are things that we need to take into account and try and steer our way through the very, really important struggles that are going to be opening up in the period ahead. So I hope everybody will participate, and that we'll get a really rich and fruitful discussion. So that's next week, and there'll be following that there'll be discussions on a new document called Trade Unions and the Struggle for Socialism, and on building the international, and on a WIN manifesto. There'll be subsequent meetings which will be notified, all of which are based on written material which are or soon will be available online. So thanks, comrades, and I look forward to seeing you all next week and at subsequent meetings. Steve, you're very welcome to join us and to come to future discussions too. I hope you don't mind if we put your email address on our mailing list, so that you're very welcome to participate in any future meetings too. Thank you again for your participation, and thanks to everybody else too.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Comrades. Bye bye. Bye everybody.